Hi, thanks for watching. Okay, so in this video, I'd like to talk about Jordan Peterson's basic opinions and commentary about the current crisis in Israel with Gaza and Hamas and the Palestinians. Okay, so, I'm not going to say that I really fully disagree with Jordan Peterson on everything. I mean, I think he has some good points, but I do think that Jordan Peterson has a kind of a dangerous lack of a broader view. I think he is so partisan that it's kind of embarrassing. You can't pretend to be an intellectual, and you can't pretend to be a wise man and sort of be like preferring sides. As you need to be a little bit neutral, because even though one side might have a lot of defects in their reasoning and they might be very wrong in some ways, you still have to have a little impartiality to see the bigger picture. Because here's why. Okay, like I also think that Hamas, they're insane. I mean, I think there's a lot of suicidal insanity going on with the Palestinians. Okay, not every Palestinian, but at least in their leadership, I think there's a lot of suicidal insanity, like total insanity. But here's the thing: if we just get caught up in noticing how wrong they are, okay, and we just get tied up in that, we're not going to see the bigger picture, to see the kind of the global dynamics, and we may end up then sort of not cashing out like realistic judgments, because here's the telltale. Basically, the summary of what Jordan Peterson says about this crisis is basically that, for whatever reason, the Palestinians have mistakenly, unwisely, sort of affiliated themselves with this like victim mentality, this like they're the oppressed people, and this kind of like this ideology of being the oppressed people, and they're making a mistake because that's an incorrect reasoning. It's bad judgment. It's not wise, and so they're sort of in the wrong. And basically, they're kind of like they're sort of falling into, as Jordan Peterson says, they're sort of falling into like the trap of like left wing ideology, as a way to sort of like justify their thug behavior. And I mean, it's not a bad analysis, actually. That is kind of what's happening, right? But then Jordan Peterson says, well, but that's a mistake, because peace is breaking out in the Middle East because we have the Abraham Accords, and they're making a mistake, because if it weren't for that mistake, then maybe all this peace would just break out in the Middle East. Okay, and he just kind of minimizes Iran, like oh well, Iran, maybe they're on the downhill, they're kind of on the way out. And I think that what that shows to me is that Jordan Peterson has already decided which side has the more correct philosophy. Okay, basically, obviously the West is better. The left wingers, they should be destined to disappear somehow. Over time, the right wing will prevail, and I think that's where I think he's dreaming. I mean, he's now I'm not saying that in some future there couldn't be, like, say, maybe more philosophical harmony in the world. Okay, there, who knows? But what I'm saying is, I think Jordan Peterson is minimizing and underestimating the power. Okay, I think Jordan Peterson is underestimating the power of the different geopolitical axes in the world. Okay, and that he is making the mistake. I think Jordan Peterson is making the mistake that geopolitical axes are just different philosophies. Okay, and that he's kind of has this naive idea that the non-Western geopolitical axes, one of these days they're just going to kind of realize the mistakes they're making in their philosophy, and then suddenly they'll just kind of come into the West, whatever. And I think the mistake he's making is, I think he maybe fails to realize that geopolitical, let's say geopolitical, let's call them continents. They're almost like tectonic plates, like the world is almost divided into different geopolitical continents. And so let's say people who are Western, we sort of belong to the Western, let's say the Western, I'm going to call it like a cultural. It's almost like a cultural continent, right? And then people who are, let's say, non-Western, they sort of belong to another cultural continent. It's almost like they belong to different planets, almost. Okay, And I think it's a mistake just because these different geopolitical axes in the world, because they have different philosophies. Okay. I think it's a mistake to say that we are deep down inside defined by those philosophies. I think the philosophies are just like a flag. It's just sort of like something convenient to attach to. But I think below these philosophies, okay, are different identities as like ethnicities. They're almost like ethnicities. They're sort of like continental ethnicities, you know. And so I think the problem that I think Jordan Peters with him is I think he doesn't fully appreciate that below the philosophies, there's sort of like a deep human identity where people don't feel Western. Okay, they just don't feel Western, right? They feel that they're something else, right? So in the end, what's really going on, okay, is that in the world, in geopolitics, we have different like identity groups, okay, where even though the Western people, we have our supposed, you know, like say constitutions and our supposed philosophies, really what we are is we're just a different, like a tribe, you know, like we're like a different culture. It's like a different worldview, you know. And so in a sense, the philosophies are just kind of like posters on the wall. And what's really going on is that some people just don't identify with the West, right? And other people just identify with a different sense of like the world, you know, like a different sense of what humans are. And so in a sense, if you were to take away the different philosophies that people use to sort of justify, I don't know, justify their culture, basically, if you took away the philosophies, you would still have different cultural identities. Okay. And I think that it's not so much a battle of philosophy as it is, the philosophy is just kind of an excuse, you know, the debates we have. Deep down inside, we're just different. Okay. And so Western people, and like say the more right-wing Western world, really is different deep down inside from the, let's say, the people who constitute the non-West, you know, whatever you want to call that, you know, the other axes of the world. Okay. And so in a sense, the philosophies are just kind of not to be taken so seriously, because really deep down inside there's different identity. People have different identity, right? And so I think Jordan Peterson is not fully appreciating that the Abraham Accords, you know, they are not all over the Middle East. Okay. The Abraham Accords are maybe just like the United Arab Emirates, and maybe, you know, like Bahrain, I think, and maybe Morocco is involved, but it's like Iran, you know. So what's really going on with the Abraham Accords is we're just reinforcing the different axes. We're just now, it's now coming more and more, you know, to the surface that even the Middle East is broken up into different axes. Okay. And so the Abraham Accords are not taking away the fact that we have different axes of geopolitical power. Okay. But what's important to realize is that the different axes of geopolitical power don't just represent different philosophies. Okay. Take away the philosophies. They also represent different ways of being human. Okay. Different identities. And so even if, let's say, Palestinians and Iranians, if they were to like adopt much more correct philosophies, let's say if they were to improve their philosophies, they wouldn't necessarily become Westerners. They would still maintain their identity as a different type of people. Okay. So I think the problem is deeper than just who has a better philosophy. You know, the mistakes that Palestine is making with their, you know, philosophical mistakes of being like oppressed people, and that's not a good philosophy. You know, it's whatever. Well, I think deep down inside, what's really going on is they don't feel Western, and they have developed themselves to feel sort of kind of distinct from how the Jewish people in Israel have essentially become sort of like a symbol of a little bit more Western identity. Okay. Um, and so really what we're dealing with, I think, is a much more powerful dynamic, which is the basic tectonic forces that sort of differentiate and distinguish different tectonic plates in geopolitical culture. And so, you know, you have to confront a much more difficult problem, which is that, you know, people who identify, like, say, with the West, like, say, the United States West, and, like, say, Western Europe, and that culture we have that is kind of the Western identity, okay? that there are some people that don't identify with that. And whether it's through a philosophy or whether it's through just a feeling, they feel as though they belong to a different world, okay, a non-Western world, okay. So I think that's the more difficult thing we have to deal with, and how to sort of accept, which is difficult, that in a sense, like say culturally, the different, like say tribes and let's say the different, I don't know, the different axes of the world, we are sort of like different planets. And even if we were to like have, even if we were to like all to improve our philosophies and sort of, even if we were to come onto the same page on a lot of philosophies, we're still going to want to distinguish ourselves because we feel like we're different people. Okay. So it's almost like the world is sort of like divided into different cultural continents. Okay. And I think at some point we have to realize that we're not all going to merge into one identical way of feeling, that some people are going to have different cultural identity, and we're going to always need some way to justify sort of maintaining a distinction. Okay. And so that to me is a harder thing to deal with. And then if there is going to be peace, peace may not look like having agreement, okay, in terms of like, let's say what's important in life, what is the human being, what is a human, how should we look at the world, just our like, to have agreement in those deep areas, deep areas of what it means to be a human being. We may not get to a point of ever having agreement in those areas, but we can still have peace. But the peace might look like sort of like, say, respecting different, let's say, cultural identities, or like deep philosophical identities, or deep identities of, what it means to be the kind of person that I am. And just to understand that there are sort of like different continents, different types of people, and maybe the idea is not so much to try to arrive at agreement, but instead to recognize that we are different, you know what I mean? But to find a way to be fully respecting of the difference, okay? And to know that the difference goes way beyond philosophy, right? And that philosophy sometimes is almost a distraction, actually, from the real differences we have, as people. And to learn to sort of appreciate and respect that people are different, okay? And somehow to develop the art of sort of interacting with people, okay, in a way where it's very clear that you respect the difference, but you want to have fair interactions, okay? And I think that's something that sometimes occurs in the world. Sometimes we see examples of that. And sometimes we see examples where we get too caught up in how we are not in agreement with the differences, okay? And we almost don't respect the differences, you know what I mean? So this is where I think we're very far, I think, from fully, how would you say? We're very far in the world from, like, say, fully getting to the, I don't know, to the, we're very far in the world from, I don't know, to sort of like just getting to the point of trying to get along with people and respecting differences. Okay. I know it's hard for me to say this because it's like, I'm trying to explain how getting along with people does not mean coinciding and sharing values. Okay. That's the hard part. That's the hard part. And so if we're not going to coincide and share values completely, all right. And if we could, and if there is a way to get along with people where we don't share values, okay, we're going to have to learn to reconceptualize what it means to get along with people. Because I think, at least for now, I think a lot of people believe you can't get along with people if you don't share basic principles. And so maybe we're talking about a much more advanced art of dealing with people, interacting with people, where we find ways to discover, let's say, a manner of getting along, right, that is not based on shared principles. And that is very advanced, okay, because we're just, well, I mean, because we're even going to want to impose like even like almost like meta standards, where, oh, even if we don't have the same standards, we still agree to like basic rules of fair play. But somebody's going to want to dominate that that body of rules, the higher rules of how we're going to like interaction, even if we don't share values. And we'll fight wars over that, and we'll bicker over who has a better philosophy. So I think in a sense, if there is going to be a future discovery of the art of getting along with people when you don't share values, okay, I think we're going to have to dismiss the idea that there's a prevailing set of rules to govern that. And we're going to have to sort of all accept a kind of a certain amount of chaos of not having an established framework, okay, that it'd have to be beyond framework, and it's sort of like a trust fall, where you have to sort of trust that with nobody dominating, like say the rules of engagement or the rules of interaction, that there potentially is a way to sort of enter into the chaos, of not having like a framework, a common framework, and yet still finding ways to interact with people through respect and appreciating the differences, and sort of like the weird art of being able to get along with people where you don't really share deep values, where our values and outlook are very different, you know. Now, I expect that if that were to take place, if there were to be like that discovery of how to get along with people when you don't share common values, um, I would think that we would have to have a combination of demonstrating strength. In other words, hey, I respect you, but by the way, I have a big army. And by the way, we are very strong, but we don't want to fight. And frankly, why even mention fighting? Just, what we have, we're strong, but, we want to try to get along with you. And it'll be very difficult because when people don't share values, okay, there will arise instances where in the course of trying to get along with people, they will commit things that for my standards are going to be very atrocious and very like heinous, and so you have to find a way to sort of allow a certain amount of like a certain amount of room for things to be done from these other people that I cannot agree with, and yet still maintain the larger interest of trying to maintain relations, and also always demonstrating that we have the potential to fight, and that we can beat you or whatever, so it's kind of a weird art, but I think you have to really demonstrate to the other side that there is at least respect. Like, we know you're different, we know you guys are different. We respect you guys, you're, whatever. We don't agree with a lot, but we have to find a way to get along and really emphasize how important it is to get along, um, so like I said, I think we're there. We've been there. We've had moments in history where we sort of have like episodes and chapters where that sort of happens a little bit. And maybe, in little ways you can see that happening, between countries. But it also is a domestic concern because if, how would you say, if Israel is sponsored, let's say if, Israel is a sponsored country, right? So if Israel is largely sponsored by sort of the traditional West, the Western world, and sort of a little bit the right wing, let's say the right wing West, even though there are left wing people in Israel, largely Israel is kind of a right wing sponsorship, to some extent. I mean, at least, to the West that right wing people love, that West is kind of a sponsor of Israel, And I think likewise, because there's a lot of symmetry in this dynamic, in this warfare between Palestine and Israel. Palestine is also sponsored. They have to be. And they're probably sponsored by a combination of like Iran. I'm sure Iran has major sponsorship throughout Palestine, right? But I also think Palestine is also sponsored, by the intellectual left wing of the Western world. Okay. And the intellectual left wing of the Western world is like within the West, it's like a separate culture. It's a separate sense of what it means to be a person. Right. And it does not mean that the intellectual left wing of the West is identical to the non-Western continents. And I say continents, I mean metaphorical continents, right? So in other words, just because the intellectual left wing of the West distinguishes itself from, like, say, the tribe of just mainstream West, right? Just because the intellectual left wing distinguishes itself, that doesn't mean they are the same as Iranians or the same as, like, say, Russians. They may have sympathies, right? Um, but that just because you're, like, say, the dissident minority critic within your own culture, okay, I think we have to still understand that intellectual left-wing Westerners are still Westerners, okay? But what they're showing is that within a continent, I say continent metaphorically, right? These are like continents of human identity, right? But within an identity continent, okay, the people who are dissident and who are critics, and so, like, say, like the left wing in the Western world, they are still Westerners, but they are kind of like a subgroup within the West, okay, that in a sense shows us that even within a major continent, you can have like little subcontinents that are not necessarily on board, you know what I mean? But that doesn't mean that they are the same thing, okay, as the actual other, like, non-Western continents, okay? There's a big distinction, right? So, but the bottom line is that even though, Western left-wing intellectuals, they're not really non-Western, they're Western, but they sponsor, and they can sponsor, you know they can sort of sponsor, like, movements in the non-West, okay? And I think we have to look at Palestine as being the non-West, okay? And it has sponsorship from non-Western entities and non-Western, I would say, forces, so, like, Iran, okay, so Palestine gets a lot of sponsorship from Iran, and they get a lot of sponsorship from the Westerners who are, let's say, in the left wing, critical, whatever you call it, that subculture, the intellectual left wing. All right. And so if you look at it more geopolitically, right? Yeah, it's true. It's true. You can criticize left-wing philosophy. Oh, look at the mistake the left wings make in their philosophy. Oh, they made this mistake. They look at the human being as a victim. They look at the human being as being like an oppressed people. Oppressed people have the right to resistance. All these fucked up ideologies, whatever. Look at the mistake they're making. Look at the mistake. But what's really happening is that I think the left-wing intellectuals in the West, what they use the philosophy is like an excuse, but what's really happening is they don't identify with the West. Okay, they don't identify with the West, and so they're almost reflecting that there are different types of people out there. Okay, and then even though there potentially could be, like, say, Palestinians who sympathize with the West, okay, through the tectonics of geopolitics, Palestine has become affiliated with the non-West, right? In different ways, through the critiques of the West who live in the West, in other words, the left-wing intellectuals of the West, but also non-Westerners like Iran and maybe Russia. I don't think Russia is directly sponsoring Palestine, but I think through Iran, there may be some advantage to Russia, because Russia is not really a Western country, But I still think Iran still distinguishes itself from other non-Western countries. So, it's like different tectonic plates, right? But I think that basically Palestine is definitely sponsored, just like Israel. So really what we have sort of like a proxy war between what looks like just Israel and Palestine, when in reality, what's really happening is this is sort of like a skirmish and a tension between the sponsors of Israel, okay, and the sponsors of Palestine, okay, and that reflects a world tectonics where there's different types of people who, despite their philosophies, right, despite whatever their philosophies are, they feel like they're different people. You know what I mean? Like they have a different sense of what it means to be a human being. Okay, and this has origins that goes back centuries. Okay, I think it's very hard for us to talk about the American West. The Western Europe of today, what we call the West. You can't talk about that without going way back to how the Catholic Church was dominating Europe, and how there emerged this Protestant movement, which was basically less of city, more rural, more independent. And basically, the byproduct of this Protestant emergence was that people who had a more individualistic sense of the human, they started emerging as a political force. And when you look at, like, say, how the Puritans arose, like, say, in as a political force in England, the mainstream of England did not really like the Puritans. Okay, and so even within England, which was already Protestant, it was almost like you had these super Protestant Puritans who distinguished themselves even more Protestant than Protestant England. You know what I mean? And so we see already that through this maneuver, which on the surface was religious, all right? And even though they'll hold on to their religious ideals like with a fist all the way to the grave, deep down inside, what's really happening is there's emerging kind of like a new tribe of people who essentially are trying to assert their sense of humanity as being more individualistic. Okay, so it's more individualistic, and those are the people who ended up populating and sort of forging the frontier of politics and sort of the political identity of what would become the United States, right? So it was, even by British standards, it was very individualistic. Okay. And it's funny because earlier Britain had broken away from mainstream Europe as one of the leading initial Protestant countries, but these Puritans were like super Protestant, and they were probably even more rural. I think it's kind of a rural mentality, sort of versus the city. But basically, we're seeing there's different types of people out there in the world. There's people who really identify with a very individualistic sense of what it means to be a human being. And there's other people for whom that's just very foreign, because they have a more communal sense of what it means to be a person. Okay, a much more sense of community, a much more sense of being sort of indistinguished from other people. And I think people who come maybe from more rural environments, more agrarian, rural, they're going to have a more independent streak just because that's just the nature of their lifestyle. But the bottom line is that the United States represents sort of the emergence of a new type of person that has a much more individualistic sense of the world. And it's not so much a question of who has a more correct philosophy, because, in a sense, philosophy, whatever, they're just policies of thought, right? What's really going on is we have this new Western type of person, which is like a new continent of people, a metaphorical continent, where people, they feel more individualistic, right? And there's other cultures, they just don't identify with that, and they just have a whole different way of looking. Okay, now I understand that Israel itself, Jewish people, they're very communal people. Okay, but they become sponsored by the West, right? So the basic original conflict in Palestine was basically just over territory. You have these outsiders these outside Jewish people that are coming in and buying all this land, and sort of being sort of sneaky and manipulative and taking over land that was occupied by basically Arabs living in Palestine. And so it's just like, hey, it's just a basic land conflict. But over time, Israel began to be identified as sponsored, okay, and their sponsorship from the West sort of allowed this to become sort of a world tension, where obviously the Palestinian people, they're going to seek sponsorship that's sort of in contrast to the sponsorship that Israel has. So, and they're also going to, at some point, they're going to adopt let's say, the philosophies of the non-West, which are at least today, they don't mind using the oppressed people, philosophy, or the philosophy of like the right to resistance, and that sort of thing. So basically, what we're seeing is that through the sponsorship, this is now just revealing a more of a world conflict. Okay, and I think in the end, this is much more of a tectonic world problem than I think what Jordan Peterson is saying. And I think he minimizes how far we are in the world from sort of learning how to get along with these different tectonic plates, these different identities, these different human identities, without falling into just who's right and who's wrong, who has a better philosophy. I think we need to respect more that we're just different types of people. So anyway, appreciate that, and thanks for watching.